A caveat about speedrunning in modern gaming is the ability to update games. When a game in the past was released, you had the final product in hand. No bug fixes, no patches. You had the complete package, and every bug that slipped through development or a rushed feature that wasn't completed yet was forever out of the hands of the developers. Speedrunners could live and work with what they had and could delve deep into a game's intricacies without worrying about anything becoming obsolete. Modern gaming, for better or worse, can change whatever was shipped to fix bugs or add features. This can be devastating when speedrunning a game, as developers often patch tricks or change aspects of the game that require routing changes. Sometimes, however, devs will listen to player feedback and even support speedrunners by adding additional features or changing game mechanics to work more in favor of speedrunning. This is basically what the developers of Celeste are doing. One of the biggest patches in the game's history was the 1.4 patch. It fundamentally changed how speedrunners approach the game and made it more accessible. So let's talk about the changes that they made that were relevant for speedrunning. Released in late March of 2021 for PC and later for consoles, this patch added mainly 6 relevant changes for speedrunners. Let's work from the back and look at these 6 changes, starting with how corner correction and floor snapping handled spikes. Spikes in this game often seem like a suggestion, but that's just because of the leniency that these have. Previously, it was even easier to die to them. But for that to make sense, I first have to explain 2 mechanics. When dashing, there are a few leniency mechanics that help you be on the ground when you are just off by a bit. When dashing into a corner, you can be moved by up to 4 pixels to clear a corner when just barely missing it. In a similar vein, when being too high above the floor, the game will move you down to floor level as long as you're up to 3 pixels above the ground tiles. These 2 mechanics were able to correct you into spikes pre 1.4, just making your life harder when using a dash close to spikes. This either made some strats harder, like this relatively common strat in City being a 1-frame window before, or just some strats were outright impossible, like this crouch dash under the door. The next 2 changes are small and quick ones. They improved some other leniency mechanics of this game. First, we have the change to bumper and fish boosts. If you hold away from them, you gain a greater boost compared to holding towards them. But now, you just have to press away as you hit them and can even do so during the short freeze that happens when you interact with them. In the past, you needed to press away before even that freeze. This made these boosts way more viable to use now, especially when not dashing towards them. So you see fish or bumper boosts all the time now. And for the second small change, this one is really minor. The death plane that decides if you die at the bottom of the room was lowered by 4 pixels. You might think that this makes absolutely zero difference, and normally you would be right. But there are rare instances where this small change is a difference maker. Like when just barely moving under the pillar and being just high enough to not die and still updash to get through the room. This is genuinely so precise that even today it's still hard. But back then, it was completely unfeasible. We are through half of the changes now. So far, they were rather small, but the next one seems small on the surface, but restructured how the whole game is being speedrun. It's the changes to the binding menu. The most apparent change is how the binding menu looks like now. Previously, you had this pretty straightforward menu. Basically everything you could need at first glance is bindable like this. But this is the keyboard menu. Controller players had this very shortened menu. While looking cute, customizability wasn't doable to the intent that keyboard had access to. But keyboard players also didn't have it easy. When trying to bind any additional key to an action, it would reset the previous key. So an action can only be bound to one key in game. They needed to directly edit the settings file to circumvent this restriction. The 1.4 update changed all of this. You are able to bind up to 8 keys to an action in-game now, and the 2 different binding menus are the same now as well between the different input schemes, which allows for as much customizability as you can think of, and additionally they reworked entirely how the game handles directions. Besides the standard default directions, you now also have menu directions. This allows you to have separate directions from your normal gameplay directions for your menuing, allowing you to not scroll through the options while holding down, like from a previous down diagonal dash. But the actual niche and unreal thing is that you can now bind something that only affects your movement or dash direction separately. Walk right, jump left and then immediately dash right? Pretty simple if you can just bind something to movement only left so you can keep holding right the entire time and press that new bind to not have to quickly switch directions. While this might all seem super niche, looking at a speedrunner's binds, you see this customizability being used to a great extent. One thing in this menu is another major thing that was added which requires its own point. A crouch dash bind. If you ever watched a run, you might have seen its use already. Named after its original finder, Demo Jameson, these by the community's so-called demo dashes were made more accessible by the devs adding a bind for it in this patch. This actually doesn't mean it wasn't possible before to make a bind for it. PC users quickly found out that you can abuse the binding priority of directions to make this possible. But what do I mean with binding priority? Directions in this game had a priority hard-coded in. So depending on what your directions were on, they had a different priority, with the lowest being anything on a keyboard that is not the arrow keys, then the analog stick for controllers, after that the D-pad, and finally arrow keys on a keyboard having the highest priority. The higher priority would override the lower priority. So by binding something to a lower priority down and dash, you were able to use the demo dash bind even before the 1.4 patch, as the higher priority directions would override the lower ones, while still keeping the crouch from the down input. However, there were a few issues with this. First, if you were a controller player or someone that doesn't use arrow keys on keyboard, you'd have to use third-party programs to be able to make this bind. This also means that console players couldn't have this bind. They were able to work around this by holding analog stick down and using the D-pad for horizontal directions. But that of course is way more awkward than just using a dedicated bind. Then lastly is that you were only able to do horizontal demo dashes like this. Horizontal and vertical directions were looked at separately. Let's just say X and Y for horizontal and vertical movement respectively. When holding left and pressing a pre-1.4 demo dash bind, the game sees a high priority X movement, so ignores the Y component for movement as its lower priority. But when you press up, you also have a high priority Y input, so the lower priority down input gets cancelled out completely. There were some workarounds, but they weren't feasible for most players. Now with this patch, binding priority isn't a thing anymore, as the directions were completely reworked. And the crouch dash bind allows you to demo dash in non-downwards directions easily now. This did allow for some new ways to use demo dashes. While horizontal demos were used the same as before, so dashing through hazards that have a gap in the hitbox, or avoiding annoying obstacles, or for so-called demo hypers, so horizontal dashes for a hyper instead of a down diagonal dash. The ease of access for upwards moving demos allowed for some new strats and optimization. Pretty much every application is very minor. I will give two examples. First up, a straight vertical up demo would mean you reach a wall slightly later because of being crouched. When you use the buffer window to press jump immediately to wall bounce, you would jump from slightly higher up, as you can see from the bottom of your hitbox being higher. This is often used to optimize landings. The next example would be one for up diagonal demos. When aiming to wall click off a corner and to demo dash into a ceiling, when moving past the corner you uncrouch when the dash is over, and with that she can reach the wall above her to be able to jump up from it. Otherwise you have to aim directly for the corner, which can be pretty tight depending on the situation. These are only two of many examples. You can see the ability for upwards demos is mostly a positional change that allows for some small optimizations. But in the end, everything small will add up. Now finally we have the, in my opinion, most influential change on how the game is being played. The ability to buffer a pause. I have used the term already, but to explain it, buffering is the ability to press an action slightly early for the input to come out at the first possible frame. Now what makes this so influential is the fact that in this game, after unpausing the game, gameplay has to advance by one frame before you're able to press pause again. Now with this change, you are able to buffer a pause and advance the game for exactly 1 frame. I don't even have to explain this further for you to be able to imagine the consequences of this. But I will do so anyway, as there are a few applications for pause buffering that aren't immediately apparent. First and foremost, it made slightly more difficult strats that were already used more accessible to players by using the ability to pause buffer parts of it. Then it can also help tremendously with understanding and trying out new strats, be it checking frame windows or just looking at some other intricacies. But the thing you are probably already thinking about is that runners have been using this to make the most impossible looking strats possible, as they can now just frame advance each input in a hard strat which have previously needed precision down to single frames. Of course, in a speedrunning context, a strat still needs to save enough time for pause buffing compared to an easier unpaused alternative. Various pause buffer strats have been found over the course of the game's lifespan since then, with various amounts of complexity over time, but all of that is maybe better left for a future video. With these smaller or bigger changes, you see now how much of an impact this made in the community. And I only talked about speedrunning relevant changes in this video. There are so many more changes that made an impact. Of course, the most important one being the 2 binoculars and the accommodating room to the left at the start of 3B. This was added for Celeste bingo, as 2 binos in a single chapter is an objective, but it also now works as my auto screen.